Good evening to one and all present here. I, Nagasudha, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, SCDC, take this opportunity to host this international webinar. Hope everyone is safe during this pandemic. Welcome to 39th International Webinar of Seshadripuram Evening Degree College, organized by Department of English in association with Lancaster University, UK, and Mississippi University, United States on Digital Humanities Session 8. At the outset, I am happy to inform you that our Evening Degree College is celebrating its Golden Jubilee year. On behalf of our college, we congratulate all the stakeholders responsible for this grand success. I now request Vinay Sagar sir to play the video of our college.
Begins with a small step. Proving this statement true, it all began in 1930. When two women, educational enthusiasts, took up a noble initiative. In the erstwhile posh locality of Seshadripuram, Srimati Anandamma and Srimati Seethamma started a primary school with 20 children. Now, Seshadripuram Educational Trust, under its umbrella, has 36 institutions. It all began with the educational visionary Sri K.M. Nanjappa, the then President of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, in 1971, which has been a landmark in the history of education for the working students by starting Seshadripuram Evening College.
Our college started with the primary objective of imparting formal education to the quality and needy. The college is affiliated to the Bengaluru Central University. Being in the heart of the city, it has an easy reach and connectivity. Its premises comprise of spacious building with good canteen, computerized library, business lab, browsing center, Wi-Fi facility, sports club, thus well equipped for all academic, sports, co-curricular like NSS, NCC, YRC, etc. and extracurricular activities throughout the year. The college organizes orientation program for freshers and guest lecturers to equip them.
As most of us are working in the morning and studying in an evening degree college, it is very facilitative for us to excel in our jobs. Even though we are studying in an evening degree college, we are being provided many state level and national level opportunities to express our talents. Also, many cultural activities are being conducted.
SEDC is engaged in various cultural activities throughout the year. There are numerous committees in the college that perform variedly on their behalf and have a lasting effect on the college, students, as well as outsiders.
Our evening degree college believes in the vision to ignite the minds of every student to identify and develop their inner strength, with the mission to promote holistic development of students by offering quality education and making them self-reliant and progressive.
Our college NCC cadets will visit every academic year in Officers Training Academy Chennai and INS Kadamba Naval Base at Konnur. It will motivate our college NCC cadets to join Indian Armed Forces.
Thank you, Vinay sir. I now request Vinay Sagar, LS, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, SCDC, to welcome and introduce all the dignitaries to this international webinar.
A very good evening to India and good morning to UK and USA. I take this opportunity to welcome you all for this international webinar in association with Lancaster University, UK, and Mississippi State University, United States. At the outset, I would like to thank all the office bearers of this great institution and welcome all of them. Now, I would like to introduce and welcome our first theme speaker, Dr. Shanmugapriya T, Department of History, Lancaster University, UK. Dr. Shanmugapriya is working as a postdoctoral research associate in the project Digital Innovation in Water Scarcity in Coimbatore, India at the Department of History, Lancaster University. She completed her PhD at IIT Indore. Her research and teaching interests focus in the area of digital humanities, digital environmental humanities, and digital literature. She is particularly interested in building and applying digital tools and technologies for humanities research. Currently, the topics she focuses for her research are text mining, geographical text analysis, and mapping and digital culture. Ma'am, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I wholeheartedly welcome you for this webinar. I am happy to introduce and welcome today's another theme speaker, Dr. Dhanashree. Dr. Dhanashree is an associate professor of English at Mississippi State University. Her research is situated at the intersection of Asian American studies, post-colonial studies, and digital humanities. Broadly, she examines how colonial and racial ideologies shape technical infrastructures, platforms, and policies. Dhanashree is a founding executive council member of the Center for Digital Humanities, Pune in India. She serves as the lead organizer for a biennial winter school on digital humanities. She is currently working on 2 book projects. The first is Digital Humanities textbook localized to the Indian context, and the second one is scholarly monograph on internet infrastructures. Ma'am, on behalf of Seshadripuram Educational Trust, I welcome you for this webinar. My proud privilege to introduce and welcome Sri W.D. Ashok Sir, Honorary Trustee of Seshadripuram Educational Trust. Sir holds a master's degree in pharmacy, specialized in the field of total parenteral nutrition. He served at the famous Al-Adan Hospital, Kuwait, over 13 years. He is Honorary Trustee of Seshadripuram Educational Trust. Sir is a backbone for all the events conducted in our evening degree college. We welcome you on behalf of our evening degree college, sir, and I request you to preside over this webinar. Now I welcome our beloved Principal Professor N.S. Satish, sir, to this international webinar. Welcome, sir. I welcome all the office bearers and trustees of Seshadripuram Educational Trust and all the principals of our sister institutions, other heads of the institutions, conveners, volunteers, and all participants who have registered across the globe. And finally, I welcome our own teaching and administrative faculty to this webinar. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Vinay sir, for welcoming all. May I now request theme speaker Dr. Shanmugapriya T, Department of History, Lancaster University, UK, to enlighten us on the topic of quantitative analysis of Indian English novels. Over to you, madam.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, now we can.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here. So I'll just kick off the presentation directly. So I hope you can see my slide.
Yes, madam, we can see.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about quantitative stepwise analysis of the impact of technological devices in Indian English novels from 1947 to 2017. So before moving into the main study, I'll provide a simple explanation of what is quantitative study, then how can we apply that in literature. Basically, as we know, quantitative studies is employed to study a large amount of text by applying computational methods and tools to extract the particular information from the text. So this can be like, this was the study applied mainly in other disciplines, for example, data analysis or like social sciences, other disciplines, but how can we apply this in literature? So for that, first I introduce some of the earlier scholars who did amazing works in the quantitative study of quantitative study of literature. So Franco Moretti and Matthew Jokers, they actually did lot of study using computational methods and tools for studying literary works. So they actually point out the problem in generalizing literature. For example, Jokers provides an analogy in that he says, a scholar who specializes in early 20th century modern poetry, early 20th century modern poetry, so he or she can provide, called upon to provide some, general generalization about the 20th century period poetry. So in that case, it's something like somewhat we are approximating literature for the entire period of 20th century. So that he calls as macro reading. So that is both Moretti and Jokers, they say that is a problematic area of doing research in the in literature. So I'll just go with more with Jokers than Moretti. And Jokers actually suggests a blended approach of both close and distant reading method. For example, close reading meaning a few literary works for a particular period, and based on that, you can elaborate the quantitative study of literature for the particular period. So then I'll move to the project. This project, the impact of, the quantitative step-based analysis of the impact of technological devices in Indian English novels from 1947 to 2017 is part of my thesis. So in that, first I did a close reading of few Indian English novels. For example, the Vendrop Sweets, Midnight Children, and the Calcutta Chromosome. These novels are actually published in different decades after independence. But there is a common thread we can see in these novels, which is the technological devices, which actually have a huge role in the plot, in directing the plot. For example, the story editing machine in the Vendrop Sweets, it actually creates attention, and radio in Midnight Children has a various role in it used as a metaphor, and it's used to connect the characters. And similarly, the AVA supercomputer in Calcutta Chromosome actually creates a network that actually unifies the story. So this close reading of these three novels provide us an overview of the technological devices that is employed in the narrative for the Indian English novels. So this suggests a pattern of technological devices over the period of 70 years. So based on this, I did a distant reading, quantitative study. So for that, I have just some objectives, which is to look at the significant change in the employment of technological devices over the period of 70 years, and also to identify the substantial discourses of each technological objects, and also to identify the overall patterns of modern objects in the novels. I also introduced a new method, quantitative step-wise analysis, which is actually inspired by the existing methods of Moretti, Jokers, Ford, and Airy. So this method can be applied to study literary works in very systematic way, and it can also apply to study either paragraphs or sentences or even words and place, names, objects oriented, and their influences in the narrative based on the scale you propose to study in the selected works. So this method has 4 stages. First is source text. In that we can collect the files, and the second is the primary model. In that we extract the particular data for the quantitative study, and we also do the cleaning the data. And the third model, we apply software and digital tools to study the extracted data, and finally we create visualizations. So based on this, I collected 47 novels based on 3 criteria. First, novels from each decade, and both canonical and non-canonical authors' novels, and novels from all sorts of settings. Then I particularly focused only 4 technological devices: telephone, radio, television, and computer. And I also included their substitutes and acronym during extraction. So in the primary model, I actually applied, I collected files and cleaned the text, and I used our software and particularly keywords in the context tool to extract the data. In the next model, I applied topic modeling, which is actually used to extract the primary results. I extracted 15 topics. For 15 topics, I extracted 30 terms to each device. So in the final the final model, I created visualizations by using online tool and Excel book. But this study also has its own limitations. And for example, first of all, the lack of digitization of Indian English novels is the primary issue which actually prevents digital humanities research in India. And another issue is the gap in the novel production. If you look at the Indian literary history of Indian English novels, which actually has a gap before 1980s, which means from 1970 to 1980s, there was a gap in the novel production. So after 1980s, the production was like increased phenomenally. So I could collect more novels after 1980s, but that is not possible before 1980s. And then, so we do not have a digital consortium where we can extract or collect digital files which can be directly used to study by using tools. So that also another issue. And then copyright issues. And then comparatively, Indian English novels is very new compared to other like British literature or other literatures. So we cannot simply easily download free digitized files because that has a copyright issues. And then apart from the limitations, so I did the quantitative study by using our software. So this is, I extracted, first I just counted the appearance of devices in the overall novels. So as we can see, telephone has the highest number than other devices. So I have created a scatter plot for these technological devices appear throughout the period from 1947 to 2017. We can see this scatter plot closely. If you look at closely, the high density actually starts after 1980s in all the devices. That's because, as I mentioned, the gap in the novel production, and another, though some of the devices like telephone and radio, they were introduced much earlier, but the consumption was like increased later after 1980s, not 1980s. That's because of many initiatives like the Department of Telecommunication and the Liberalization Act in 1991. So these kinds of initiatives increase the production and also consumption. And for example, and then if we closely move to one each device, the first is telephone. As we can see that though it starts from 1980s, but the density like really goes up after 1995 or 6 or 7, 8. So that's because by the time the telephone converts into modern technology like Android, mobile phones and all, so it has multiple features, and then basically it actually was used much in the novels as it was used in the society. And then radio actually density starts after 1980s, but slightly it falls down after 2005 or 6. That's because other technological devices actually taken over the radio. And computer, we can see some consistency in the use of computer in the novels, narrative novels. That's because in the early period, like from 1980s, Salman Rushdie, Anita Desai, and then who else? Okay, I'm just forgetting some names. So those writers, they used computer device as a symbol of modernization in the narrative. So which is why some of the appearance in the 1980s, and then it actually has increased after 2000. That's because it also converted into a modern device, which is actually has multiple features that so people used throughout the day, that also used as one of the element in the narrative. And television, though television was actually introduced much earlier in the 1970s, but it was considered as a luxury product in the beginning. So, but it was removed from the list of luxury product. The consumption actually increased in an unexpected level. And then, so after 1995, due to many other initiatives like private channels and Doordarshan channels, they started increasing their programs. So that also reflected in the narrative. So overall, these scatter plots provide an overview of how technological devices appeared throughout the period. But let's move to the topic modeling analysis. First is discourse of telephone artifact, which I actually named as discourse of gendered facets. That's because I can segregate the keywords into two types. First is women facets and second is men facets based on the keywords. So for example, women facets, the keywords like she, her, they, and other associated terms like long, a house, night, left, father, home, and these words indicate the domestic sphere. And whereas for men characters, there are number of men characters appeared for telephone artifact, like Agastya, Madana, Parker, Arvind. I mean, I just put only few names here, but more than these names, there are number of names. But there are associated terms like place, international, job, meet, happy, soft, collector, uncle, district. I mean, these kind of words that somehow like connected to the social sphere. So to understand this pattern, like we cannot just analysis based on these keywords, but so we need to jump into the history of women characters in English novels. So based on that study, we can come to some kind of conclusion about the use of telephone for both male and female characters. And for example, Shanta Krishnaswamy in her book, The Women in Indian Fiction, 1950 to 1980, says that the liberation and equality are hard to reconcile for women characters. And similarly, the critic Meenakshi Mukherjee says, one might argue that the classical ideas no longer apply in the Indian context. But in actual literary practice, numerous characters are found to be adhered to classic prototypes, especially the women of fiction, who persistently reenact the suffering, sacrificing her loves in thought Savitri. So other critic Steve Durnans, in his essay Men's Sexuality, Men's Sexuality and Women's Subordination in Indian Nationalism, in which he says that like men are mostly associated with like science and modernization, westernization than women in India. So, and if you also look at the literary history, pre-independence writers like R.K. Narayan, Ugrashanand, Raja Rao, Kamala Markandeya. So these writers actually portrayed the predicament of women characters in their novels. But after independence, writers like Anita Desai's Deshpande, Nayanthara Segal, they were trying to portray changing face of women's lives in India. But in both cases, women characters always like fight for their rights, amenities, and equalities, which always have confined with only the domesticity. So this kind of attitude and milieu could be reflected in the topic terms. And the next is discourse of television artifact, which I named as discourse of character. So female characters' names and the topic terms which are associated with the characters are sense, addict, and thought. And male characters' names and associated terms are election, coming, rich, community, sees. So which somehow indicate different kind of settings. For female, it sounds like domestic sphere. Again, for male, it sounds like again social sphere. So and of course, television is a domestic property, and so some of the terms like tea, dining, food, kitchen, bedroom, these all appear. But still, if you look at closely these terms, we can also see only female terms like mother, women. So to understand this pattern more closely, then I actually went back to study the history of television in India. So in her article, Jayashree Kalanidhi, Imagining Audience Through the Sun and Women's Programming, in which she says that many programs in many programs which is displayed in Indian television, which actually portray women. There are many shows that actually targeted only for women audience. For example, cookery shows and makeup tips and healthcare and home management. These programs actually targeted only women audience. And then we can see many examples of such kind of narrative in some of the novels which I mentioned here. And this actually becomes even worse when it comes to discourse of computer artifact. Discourse of which I named as a discourse of male characters. There are many male characters names appeared, but just only one female character appeared for this computer artifact. And these male characters and the associated terms like cyber cafe, talking, Gucci, and make female travel, which indicate somehow like like against social sphere. And writers actually portray this computer artifact as a source of occupation for male characters, and they use this device to explore the world, and also they use to represent their skill of male characters. So the overall pattern of modern devices in the narration of novels actually suggests a pattern of gender disparity. So all these cultural apparatus merely employed to reinforce the old prejudice, or these social or network institutions deployed to bring new messages, or are they creating new ideologies for gender? So this kind of chain of questions actually popped up in my mind when I come to the conclusion. So the close observation of the research and discussion bring our attention to look at the considerable lacuna in the narration of the liaison between male and female characters with technological devices. First of all, the number of male characters' names appear frequently than the names of female characters. The narration gap of genders unambiguously exemplifies the gender disparity in the first place. Many scholars like Ruthi Menon, Nivedita Menon, Rajeshwari Sundarajan, Shanta Krishnasamy have been discussing the struggles of women for their identities, rights, recognitions, and equalities in the society and literary novels. However, the gender inequality in the science and technologies belong in terms of discourses about the occupation, access, and harness are less conversed topics in India, and particularly it has been overlooked in Indian literary scholarship. Gender disparity is a common phenomenon in India in terms of access to education, economic conditions, science, and technological fields. And not surprisingly, the technological gender gap in the narration of the novels paints such kind of disparity for women characters regarding the possession and accessibility of modern gadgets. The conventional literary interpretation of women about their role and status in the society has been questioned since 1960s. Many writers like Smith Chakutai, Amit Pritam, Mahavastwa Devi, Krishna Subiti, Kamala Das, and Kamala Markandeya have actually coached and explored the concepts of bodies, identities, and sexualities. Nonetheless, R.K. Gupta says, I quote, oppression and exploitation of women have been a ever-presented theme in Indian literature. He also says, many modern Indian writers have continued to project and sustain traditional values and to extol old roles and models in their presentation of women. So in such a milieu of women characters in the history of Indian English novels, the topic terms of women presence for telephone and computer technologies reinforce the traditional ideologies that women are bought from harnessing technologies which are presumed as predominantly belong to the male community. The novelists tend to pursue the conventional ideas that man can embrace the education, technology, and science for which feels it's overtly compromised that women are not primarily entitled due to many socio-cultural factors. So overall, these technologies are exercised to reinforce the traditional ideologies and create new conventional ideologies for women and men. Such representations of disparity are naturalized and integrated into narrations and formulated a normative mode of gendered categories. Women are invariably marginalized or hidden throughout the history of technology, which is explicitly or implicitly represented in the narration of the novels, and our topic modeling results correspond to such stereotypical gender inequality. So thanks to DH, which helped to locate this new insight in the narration of the novels, which would have been gone unnoticed otherwise. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful theme address. May I now request Dr. Dhanashree ma'am, Assistant Professor of English, Mississippi University, to enlighten us on the topic Infrastructure of Data Colonialism. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Shanmuga. That was really fascinating research. I hope you don't mind if I start sharing my screen over
Sure.
yours.
I'm just looking for to stop this. I feel like I'm just lost somewhere. Why I couldn't do anything with this? It says only new share. What?
I think I got you.
Oh, okay.
Let's see.
I think it's done. I think
Yes.
it's stopped now.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Okay. So before I start, I just want to say thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Good evening, everyone in India. And I'm so delighted to be here. Thank you, Professor Konnur, for your emails and for inviting me to this event. I really appreciate you all being here. It's a very stressful time right now, and everybody's very busy. So thank you for making some time to listen to us. And congratulations, of course, to the college on your Golden Jubilee celebrations. That is quite a momentous occasion. And the fact that you are hosting, a digital humanities series and thinking about the future of Indian education is really interesting. So I'm so happy to be a part of this. So let me get my PowerPoint going here. I think I've got too many things open. So let's see. There we go. So I'm going to start by asking you all a question. Where does our internet come from? Somewhere, right, in everybody's house or whichever room you're in right now, you have a modem and a router and you have internet access, right? But Shanmuga is in the UK, I think. I'm in the US. So how is it that we are all getting internet? What enables this kind of networking? Now, when we think about other services like electricity, we see the infrastructure, right? All of you have seen these wires, these poles on Indian streets, and they've become so normal to us that we don't even see them anymore. If I ask you, where does your water come from? You would probably say there are pipes, right? Somewhere underground that bring water to your house. But when I say, where does your internet come from? Most likely, most of you don't know, right? Beyond the space of your own home, how we get internet. So what I'm going to do today is talk about internet infrastructure on a transnational level and talk about literally the pipes and wires, the cables. There are internet cables which are lying. I see Shanmuga looking very skeptical because it's true, right? There are literally cables which are laid on the ocean floors, which enable us to have internet access transnationally. Somewhere in the process of me speaking here, and all of you hearing me, the signal is passing through these underwater cables across the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, most likely, and coming to you, right? So these are some images of this infrastructure. On the top, there is an internet cable that's being towed out to the Arabian Sea. And on the bottom, this is actually a ship that is going to travel across the Atlantic and lay and spool this cable on the Atlantic Ocean bed. So this, what I'm showing you here, is a map of the internet. You are looking at just over 450 submarine cable lines which travel undersea between continents. This is a map of the internet. This is a material map of the internet infrastructure. These cable lines are so essential to the internet that they carry about 99% of internet traffic. The remaining 1% is carried by satellite internet, which is not very effective, actually. So this is the heart of the internet right here. These cable lines are the material backbone of the internet, but rendered out of sight under the oceans. We don't usually think about them, their origins, their topography, their ownership, their operation, until something goes wrong, right? Something does not work, and then we say, what happened to the internet, right? So my talk today is going to trace the imprint of colonialism on that colonial geography that I just showed you. I'm going to highlight the connections between two seemingly unconnected ventures. The first is the telegraph lines, the infrastructure of the telegraph, which was built in South Asia in the 1800s, mostly by the British. And then the transition from that into the modern fiber optic cable infrastructure. And then the second thing I'm going to do is touch very briefly on why this is important to this conversation on data colonialism. All of you have most likely heard this term data colonialism. Scholars like Paula Ricarte, Nanjala Neabola, Abeha Birhane, many people have been talking about this, right? And it's mainly used to talk about the extraction of data from the global south. So all of us get connected to the internet, and companies like Facebook extract our data, commodify it, and sell it. And this is talked about as data colonialism. And I'm going to show you, why we need to historicize that conversation, because data regimes are not a new phenomenon, right? Google and Facebook are new digital empires with very old roots. So to begin, this is a map of telegraph networks, right? So I'm going to show you a lot of maps today. The telegraph industry, as some of you may know, began with successful experiments in Europe and America, and undersea cable lines became a major commercial interest for British companies after 1851. This sprawling global communication network was actually colloquially labeled the Victorian internet in retrospect, because it was so widespread, so important to that time period. The commercial interest in transcontinental telegraphy in the late 1800s was encouraged by their sponsoring colonial empires. The telegraph industry was tied first to the British Empire and later to the French and German empires, which sought to connect their colonies for more effective governance. The British, for example, had this very well-known all-red line which connected their colonies at that time period. The telegraph was a preeminent project of Western modernity. Colonial empires controlled the natural resources, the labor, the means of production, the scientific knowledge, and financial resources to build telegraph networks that suited their interests, right? So without the natural resources and labor exploited and extracted from the colonies, this global network could not have been built. In India, for example, native artisans were required to assemble the parts needed to build telegraph lines overland. The internationalization of this technology was also enabled by the British monopoly in the business. It was actually propelled by this raw material called gutta percha, which is pictured here. And this turned out to be, through a slew of experiments, they realized that this was the only latex that could actually insulate the underwater cables in that time period, right? Because if the cables are traveling underwater, you have to have something to insulate them. Native to the Malay Peninsula, modern-day Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Singapore, gutta percha was a tree sap, which became so essential to the growth of the British telegraph industry that the tree was over-harvested and became nearly extinct in just 50 years after its discovery by white scientists. So the most advanced scientific development of its heyday required a natural substance harvested from the colonies in order to become a commercially viable global industry. Now, this is the kind of counter-narrative that Sandra Harding advocated for when she called for a counter-history of the achievements of modern Western science and technology. Without gutta percha and the extractive, ecologically devastating practices of colonialism, we don't know whether we would have had a global telegraph network in this time period. So this is really a form of infrastructural violence, right? That's what I'm trying to point out here. And we know that this was a technology of war. The telegraph industry created data regimes that were bounded to colonialism and underpinned by racial capitalism. John Pender, the so-called cable king, who made his profits off this cable industry and later became a member of the British Parliament, very famously claimed telegraphs know no politics, and yet we know that's not true, right? The telegraph in India was very much invested in the business of empire. The British Empire sponsored the network in India on a premise that we know very well today, that data is power, right? And we know this, we hear this all the time, we see this happening, right? But the British Empire knew this too, right? That control over information was very important. And hence control over the technology and the dissemination of that technology of information was also very important. After the Indian War of Independence in 1857, the telegraph network became very much entrenched in colonial administration. And so you have a lot of writers, scientists from the time period who talked about how important it was to controlling the continent. So the brief kind of cultural history of the telegraph that I have outlined so far points to a scientific innovation which was far from neutral, right? Instead, it was weaponizing a scientific innovation, investing in its reproduction with government funding, and then the colonial administration turned the telegraph into an instrument of control. There is this kind of iterative logic to the network. Colonialism created a need for a global communication network, and this need could only be fulfilled due to the very resources available to white scientists due to colonization. Now, this would be a familiar history to you, right? You might have expected this. We know in India also that the railways were built in a similar way, right? Initially built as a means of control. What is unexpected, however, is the legacy of the telegraph network, right? And what it has done for us today. So, although this network itself has changed, some of its policies remain unchanged. Internationally, the telegraph lines have today morphed into the fiber optic cable lines. Telegraph lines, however, spread through the world in uneven and hierarchical patterns, driven by the needs of the various empires in the late 19th and early 20th century. Strategic ports, routes, and connection points were chosen by telegraph companies backed by their sponsoring empires. The colonies, of course, had very little control over this venture before independence. And after independence, sometimes lacked the financial and industrial resources to pursue their own telegraphy projects, precisely because of the ravages of colonialism. So the cables have been upgraded, but their geography dates back to that same telegraph network. Nicole Starosielski very famously writes about this in her seminal work and says that cable companies have tended to lay new lines on proven routes, right? So they are basically building over the same kinds of lines. And the result of this is that cable routes sometimes can be circuitous, but they still center colonial powers, right? The former colonial powers. This is a very risk-averse industry to some extent because these projects are very expensive. And if you look at some of these maps and see the transitions between the older maps and the current maps, you can see some of these points of connection, right? Where you can notice that the routes are still very similar. Note as well on this map on the right, look at New York and look at how many cables are leaving New York. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, but you can see some of these overlaying lines that have been built atop the same infrastructures. So the long-lasting impact of the telegraph has had drastic consequences for post-colonial nations. Let me highlight some of these problems for you. Some countries only have one cable landing station or a single cable connecting it to the internet. And a cable landing station is basically a point where an undersea cable comes ashore, either to receive electricity, which will power the signal on, or it's a point where the cable connects to domestic infrastructure. Cables that lack the built-in redundancy of multiple landing stations and multiple lines can be drastically affected by breaks in the cable. These cables are actually known to break because sometimes a ship will come into a harbor, not know that there is a cable under the ship, and they drop anchor and actually sever the cable. And if that's your one cable connecting you to the internet, it can have drastic consequences, right? So in 2018, Mauritania lost internet access for 48 hours when the single cable connecting it to the internet broke. Right, so a country's entire internet cannot be premised on a single cable. And yet that is precisely the case for many countries even today. To give you a rough comparison, the United States has 15 cable landing stations on just one coast, right? Just on the West Coast alone, there are 15 stations. India does relatively well. I think we have 5 or 6, which is actually not too bad for a post-colonial country. These cable breaks, of course, are significant because they not only affect, individual users, but also business corporations, government functionality. And thus, these cable stations are connected to concerns about sovereignty and national and economic security in a country. Now, the cables that surround the African continent reveal other inequalities and incongruencies in this network. So on the picture on the left, where I say no branches, look at what's happening to Eritrea. What you're seeing is a lot of cable traffic that's passing between just off the coast of Eritrea, but never actually connects to Eritrea, right? So there is no direct connection between Eritrea and this international infrastructure. And that's actually 12 cables that pass just offshore. And then on this picture on the right, you are seeing something which I call the relay station model, right? And these relay stations are basically locations where a number of cable lines come ashore to receive electricity, and yet the country itself has very low internet access. So Djibouti, which you can actually see in both the pictures, has 12 cables which come ashore at this station, but the country has an internet penetration rate of 18%, right? So think about that for a moment. There are 12 international cable lines, fiber optic cable lines with tremendous capacity, passing just off your shore, coming ashore, but this is a country with 18% internet penetration. This cable station is so significant in Djibouti city because it is a transit point for lines connecting 50 countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific, right? So I'll say this again. This is a country that's enabling internet access for 50 other countries, but itself does not have good internet access. And Djibouti is not alone in this. So landing stations like Djibouti City stand out as geopolitical areas with internet access incommensurate with the cable lines passing through them. And this indicates a continuing pattern of exploitation under neocolonialism as countries in the global south enable the connectivity of the developed West, even as they remain underdeveloped. Right? So I can't really emphasize enough what is going on here with a colonial era communication network shaping the material infrastructure of the internet today. And this is why I think we need to think about data colonialism historically. Our digital platforms and infrastructures are rooted in deeper histories of oppression, right? And sometimes this imprint is invisible. if you take a look at who actually owns these cable lines, you are going to see similar issues again, right? Ownership of this global infrastructure follows colonial patterns. As I said earlier, the telegraph network was mainly built with private capital and by British, French, and later American companies, right? Because these were the former colonial powers that had the financial resources and the technical kind of specialization to actually lay the cable lines, the telegraph cable lines in that time period. Now, this pattern of private ownership in the hands of a small number of American and European conglomerates has continued. The so-called backbone of the internet comprises of these cables, of these global tier one providers who actually own the cables and then sell capacity to other smaller providers. And unsurprisingly, of course, these rankings are really dominated by American and European conglomerates, with only two Asian companies. One is Nippon, which is a Japanese company, and the other is Tata Communications, right? So familiar name for the Indians in the audience. Tata Communications actually owns a very significant number of these cable lines. Historically, countries in the global south were perceived as unprofitable internet markets, right, for the most part. But today there is this rush for everybody to build undersea cable lines to connect Asia, Africa, South America to the internet. Because at the end of the day, you can't harvest data about people if they are not connected to the internet, right? So now you see Google is getting into this. Microsoft and Facebook have really gotten into it, and they have kind of started laying their own cables because they no longer want to lease capacity on these other cable lines. So I want to come to the last part of my talk now and really, just ask you, like, what do we do with this, right? If this is a colonial network, how do we decolonize this network, right? What are the alternatives that we have to think about? And I'm going to very briefly suggest three possibilities, three options that we are kind of already seeing. One of them is the model of Tata Communications, that is the CCOM cable on the left here. Now, Tata Communications is very interesting. As I said, it is a major cable company at the moment because it was much better attuned to local and regional needs. And they have really tried to connect more post-colonial countries. And their growth actually is because of post-colonial countries, because they started connecting countries that other Western cable providers did not see as profitable. So this CCOM line, which connects East Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, part of this line, this East African section, was actually built with 75% African investment, right? So from companies and governments in the region. Now, this is a different model because historically cable lines, went from the global north to the global south, right? They were meant to connect, or from the global north to other global north countries. They were meant to connect first world countries, so to say. And this is a very different model of thinking, right? Because they are oriented towards global South-South collaboration. And there's a way of envisioning a kind of linked post-colonial future where there is regional co-development between post-colonial countries. And there is cooperation to build this kind of infrastructure, which is still very expensive to build. The other example, which is in the middle, is Teams, which is another cable line. And this was actually built with 85% of local investment in countries along the line. The DARE cable is another example, which I haven't pictured, from Djibouti to Kenya. And these are all examples of local cable lines. They don't go across oceans or travel very far, but it is local countries, local companies realizing that there is an unmet need within that region, and so they are kind of building their own infrastructure instead of relying on Facebook or Google or Verizon or somebody else to do it. Now, of course, the issue with both of these is that, control of the internet still relies on private corporations, right? So I don't want to embrace this model of Tata's business too uncritically. Even if companies like Tata are based in post-colonial countries and were intended to serve post-colonial people, they still risk duplicating the colonial operations of other tier 1 providers. Right. So right now I've seen companies like Reliance that are very good actually about co-opting the language of data colonialism, right? Even though they are themselves sometimes engaged in practices that are not always ethical, right? So the lasting harms of colonialism cannot be remedied by transferring power from Western elites to post-colonial elites, right? From Western companies to post-colonial companies. At the end of the day, that's not a model that is still sustainable or ethical. We know this. And then, of course, the issue is that when Asian countries like India and China are building these large infrastructural projects in the African continent, that can represent another form of structural power, right? And we have to be very careful not to replicate colonial ideologies in these kinds of projects. So a third alternative, which is very interesting, eschews companies altogether. And it's basically communities that come together and say, we are going to build our own infrastructure and we have a say in how that infrastructure runs, how it is operated. And so this is a third kind of model of community-owned, community-based internet infrastructure. And there are small examples of it that have worked. The major issue with this is just that it is very expensive to do international transcontinental networking. And so this is a model that works on a smaller scale, but has not been tested on a broader scale. So to summarize everything that I have said so far, this is where I've brought us, right? So we have a telegraph network which was built through colonial exploitation, and we are thinking about how to decolonize it. And to do that, we have to know the why and the what. We have to have a vision for what kind of equitable future we want, right? There's also all kinds of other questions that we have to consider when it comes to data colonialism. What kinds of data ownership models do we want? What role do humanities scholars play in this kind of conversation? How do we account for issues like e-waste, which is dumped in countries like Ghana or countries like Rwanda and DRC, where minerals are mined in order to make our technologies and infrastructures work? Right. And overall, to conclude, what I would say is that post-colonial people in this context must be collaborators, consultants, partners, developers. We have to be a part of these solutions, right? We can't be other people for whom things are done and brought to our continent, but we have to be the ones to kind of envision and create these solutions. And I do this work in the spirit of the technology, the radical technologies that we have seen being repurposed in India, right? The telegraph and the railways was reused by Indian revolutionaries to kind of take back the continent from the British. And so maybe there are different models for us within the Indian continent for how we can decolonize these networks. So thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful theme address. Now the floor is open for interaction. As we are running out of time, we take up only few questions which we have received from the registration form. I now request Vinay sir and DK sir to moderate the interaction session.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. My question is to Shanmugapriya, ma'am. Ma'am, can I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, what challenges you have encountered while doing quantitative analysis on Indian English novels?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. As I mentioned, first of all, lack of digitization is the huge challenge that I encountered. Actually, in the particularly for the period of post-independence, the immediate period, like 1947 to till 1990s. So it was very difficult to collect digital files. So either it was like just a scanned images of like the book, or just only the physical material. So that was the challenge, first challenge. And the second challenge, like the other Indian DHS scholars, I was also like having a problem with using technology. So initially, then I spent a lot of time to learn programming, and then I did the quantitative study. That was the other challenge.
Ma'am, one more question.
Yeah,
Ma'am,
sure.
is this digital humanities a boon or a ban to the publishing houses?
Some kind of tricky question, I say. It should be like a boon rather than ban. Like if you look at the current condition, like the ongoing issue in India, if we say in India, it's very much like we are still like back, like compared to many things. First of all, we do not have proper digital platform for publishing, like even the if you want to publish digital humanities related articles, then you have to go for like the foreign journals. You cannot have maybe one or two, like as I already published in Dhanashree's volume, like the Asian Digital Humanities publishing, like publishing journal. So maybe one or only you can find one or two avenues, but it's like still we have to go like very much forward. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, next question to Dhanashree, ma'am. Ma'am, can I?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. What is the digital humanities textbook localized to the Indian context?
Yes, so this is actually a very exciting project that I'm working on with the Center for Digital Humanities in Pune. And we are essentially assembling a textbook which will be an open access project. I know you just asked the question about publishers and digital humanities, and we are essentially creating this with the understanding that it will be free and it will be open access. So anybody will be able to read this. And I say it's localized. This is just, you can look at this link, but this is the project and these are the different topics we are covering. And essentially we are saying that, there's a lot of interest in digital humanities in India, but there is not a kind of a handbook or guidebook or textbook that will introduce all the topics to participants or to interested readers yet. And we are localizing this essentially by really emphasizing that we have Indian writers. We very much want this to be a platform, a project where Indian scholars can contribute related to their expertise. And it's not just always the same names, right, from America or the UK that you see all the time in DH publications. So it's emphasizing local knowledge, local expertise, and we are also asking all of our writers to contextualize digital humanities in India. So for example, Ridhima Sharma is writing about feminist DH, and she is talking about that in the Indian context, right? Because the issues related to feminism in India are very particular. So even if we take into account global developments in DH, we also have to think about local landscapes and local developments in DH, which are unique and different from what has happened elsewhere. So it's an exciting project. It should be coming all out this summer. So please keep a lookout for it. I'll tweet about it. But if anybody is interested, please email me.
Yep. And ma'am, one more question. How can we help with this particular education system in India?
That is a very big question. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to answer this question. But I mean, I think what you're all doing here, is already a start. The fact that you're thinking about digital humanities and, what is the future of Indian education when our students are online, our students are learning right now in an online platform quite a bit. And what do these changes mean for Indian education? And I do think globally we have to think about adapting our curriculums, adapting our practices, and also helping our students think about new skills. I mean, Shanmuga's research is so interesting. As she said, she had to develop those programming skills to do work in R, and that's really not a skill that's taught in Indian institutions at the moment, at least not to humanities scholars. And yet, for those of us who want to do DH, some kind of programming knowledge is actually kind of helpful. And so, I know we have a number of institutional folks here in the administration. And I think that is really something to think about. What are the new digital skills that students need in order to be, good on the job market, in order to live in this kind of new digital world? We may have to do a whole series of conversations on this question, though. So if anybody wants to chime in, please do so.
Maybe these kinds of recent webinar in DH is one kind of example that like we are moving forward. So actually, I'm glad to see many DH events recently. And there are many institutions, they are like started their first DH courses and programs that can be set an example for us. Maybe other like central universities, state university, it may take little time to pick up because they have these kind of colonial administrative process. Like it's very difficult to bring new courses, new programs. It's not very easy one. So, but like, these kind of like events push the administration and other legislation, like, formulas. So it can be, it will work in near future, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Shanmugapriya ma'am and Dhanashree ma'am. This is all about from the Q&A session. Over to Nagasudha ma'am.
Thank you very much, respected speakers, for answering the questions for the participants. A small announcement before presidential remark. We will now send the feedback form link in the chat box as well as to your registered mail ID, which will be active for next 48 hours. Kindly fill the same and send back for e-certificates. The e-certificates will reach you from 7 to 10 days. Very shortly, we will meet in one more international webinar of our evening degree college, that is on 20th April 2021, Tuesday. The topic is Global Standards in Library Science, Session 3, in association with Kent State University, Ohio, US. May I now request Shri W.D. Ashok Sir, Honorary Trustee, Seshadripuram Education Trust, to render presidential remarks.
A good evening to one and all. From Seshadripuram Evening Degree College, Department of English, associated with Lancaster University, UK, and Mississippi State, USA, bringing this Digital Humanities Session 8 with this platform of webinar. A wonderful topic has been chosen and two eminent speakers have spoken on different topics: quantitative analysis of Indian English novels by Madam Shanmugapriya, who has given the studies which states that large amount of text studying a corpus of text by applying computerized methods, how it can be improved in the Indian ways, and information extraction, how it can be done, and how the reading of novels in the computerized versions, and for example, how Calcutta Chromosomes, which is a old version, but still how the studies are going on. At the same time, I just want to say that she has emphasized that studying works in a systematic way still needs, that is, source text has to be much revised and also updated. Many versions have to be updated because old texts are there. So new knowledge and new ideologies about the system has to be brought about. And at the same time, team speaker, Dr. Dhanashree, assistant professor. Her studies mostly in the Asian American studies, post-colonial studies, but at the same time, she has given a wonderful structure about how infrastructure of data colonialism. Actually, she has given a wonderful platform for us, and she has explained like a brief introduction of how the telegraph was happening and how the internet system has been evolved. She has given wonderfully the cable systems, the satellite internet, how it has been adopted newly, the transition from the telegraph lines to the optic fiber cables. That is how the British or the Europeans have dominated the colonial empires from that age to the current scenario, how it is being exploited. At the same time, she has given wonderfully. And also she emphasized that in the colonial period, using telegraphs in the railway systems and creating a monopoly and maintaining the upper hand in the colonial rule was also maintained using technology at the same time. And one more thing, Madam Dhanashree mentioned that internet cable traffic and the cable station, their movement around and the geographical position, and all this she has explained in a wonderful way. I would like to thank both the speakers in their international webinar and their participation in such a wonderful way. I thank both of them and all the participants who have taken up today's webinar. And I just want to thank Principal S.N. Satish sir, and at the same time coordinators of the Department of English, HODs. And at the same time, I want to thank Vinay Sagar and Nagsudha madam. Thank you one and all for today's webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for the presidential remarks. I now request Ranga sir, Assistant Professor, Department of Commerce, SCDC, to render vote of thanks.
Hi everyone, it is my proud privilege to propose vote of thanks on behalf of Seshadripuram Evening Degree College on this occasion. Firstly, I would like to thank all the office bearers of Lancaster University, United Kingdom, and Mississippi State University, United States for associating with us to organize the wonderful event. I would like to express our sincere gratitude to theme speaker, Dr. Shanmugapriya T, Department of History, Lancaster University, United Kingdom, for rendering a theme talk on the quantitative analysis of Indian English novels. I am humble and grateful to you, madam. I would like to express our sincere thanks to Dr. Dhanashree Thorat, Assistant Professor of English, Mississippi State University, United States, for giving an excellent theme talk on infrastructure of data colonialism. Thank you, madam, for your valuable words. I express our sincere thanks to Sri W.D. Ashok sir, Trustee, Seshadripuram Educational Trust, for rendering presidential address. Thank you, sir. My special thanks to our beloved, young and energetic principal, Professor N.S. Satish sir, who is the robust of our Seshadripuram Evening Degree College and guiding us all the time with his valuable inputs to organize this event successfully. I would like to thank Dhareppa Konnur, Program Coordinator, Rajat BS, Coordinator IQAC, and who have helped us with materialize this webinar. I express our gratitude to all the principals, conveners, and members of our sister institutions and other colleges, academicians, research scholars, students, and delegates across the globe for participating in this webinar. We will ever remain grateful to our teaching and administrative staff for their support. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Shanmugapriya ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Once again, thank you, one and
Dhanashree
all.
ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Ashok sir, for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, madam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dhanashree,
Thank you
madam.
all. So may I leave now?
Sure, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, madam.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Nice seeing you all and meeting you virtually.
Thank you.